what I've learned in my years of pastoring now is that this idea of foreknowledge and predestination can be a bit divisive. I don't know if you have picked up on any of that, and it can be divisive on both sides of the aisle, if you will. Now, all right, I have seen a lot of people that these two ideas are caricaturized into something they are not, painted to be something they're not, and portrayed to be something they're not. All right? And then I have met way too many in my life, very young men who can't generously and graciously understand the doctrines of grace in such a way and explain them in such a way that they are winsome and beautiful. There are certain guys that go through a type of theological puberty where I wish we could just put you in a cage and then let you out a few years later. All right? Truth should be handled like a scalpel, never a club. Never a club. You wield these truths like a club, you don't understand these truths. You tracking with me? Like how in the world you could talk about foreknowledge and predestination in a way that is arrogant, condescending, and belittling will forever baffle me. You simply reveal you don't understand this thing at all. And so what I've learned about those who struggle with these two things, foreknowledge and predestination, is a lot of times they'll play one of two games. The first game is to go, well, I see that. I see foreknowledge and predestination, but I just don't think those words mean what you think they mean. Like, I know he said foreknowledge, but what I think he means is, and I know he said predestined to determine beforehand, but what I think he means. And so I always just want to, if you read the Bible, does the Apostle Paul come off like a guy who uses slang? Does he? Like, if Paul calls you a fool, that's not like, you're his boy. All right, what's up, fool? All right, that's not, he's calling you a fool. All right? It's not slang. He thinks you're a fool. All right? And when he calls the teachers in the churches of Galatia those dogs, he's not saying those were his friends. All right? Paul doesn't use slang. So when he says those whom he foreknew, he predestined, he means that those whom God foreknew, God predestined. And so that's the first game. And then the second game is that people will say, well, on foreknowledge and predestination, what's happened is that God is so all-knowing that God knows who's going to take their faith and put it in his grace. And since he knows who's going to choose him, all right, he knows who's going to look back and say, I'm going to take my faith and I'm going to put it in God's grace, that's how this thing works. Now, what's the big problem with that? Well, the big problem came out of Ephesians 2 yesterday, didn't it? That the faith to believe in the grace is also a gift of God, not by men, so that no one would boast. So that the idea that God somehow has got in the DeLorean, adjusted the flux capacitor, jetted forward and figured out who all's going to pick him and who's going to take their faith and put it in the grace he's provided, and then, went back before the beginning of the foundation of the earth was laid and wrote that in the Lamb's Book of Life and shut it down. Let's get to work now. Press play. That idea is shattered on the rock of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, when it says, by grace you have been saved through faith, and this, Danny says, both grace and faith, this faith, to believe in that grace, was given to you by God. It is not yours, so that you would have nothing to boast in. And so I've had people go, that's not true, Pastor. Like, I walked up and I shaked my pastor's hand and we prayed and I accepted Christ, and I have argued and will argue until glory. God saved you in your seat. God saved you in your seat, because if you praying, repeating a prayer up front from your pastor saved you, then we're witches, not Christians. That's an incantation. That's not regeneration. Now, a pastor might have been your guide up front. But what compelled you to get out of your seat and come forward was the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit in your heart. So somebody might have helped you put words to it, might help shape you, but when all's said and done, you got saved in that seat. Got saved in that seat. So we've talked about what it's not, so let's talk about what it is. And I think the best way, I think the fair way to do this is look at how the Bible uses this idea of knowing in its context, or in the context of how God knows. And there's a few little problems in how the Bible talks about God knowing that I think that'll help us in figuring out and getting to the bottom of what foreknowledge is, okay? And so in Amos chapter 3, verse 2, you don't have to turn there, God says through the prophet Amos, "You only have I known among all the families on the earth." Now, what's the problem with that? It almost makes it sound like there are families of the earth that God is not aware of. Right? So through the prophet Amos to the covenant community of faith, you alone have I known among all the families of the earth. We know at one sense that's not true. Like that God is not, all right, unable to see the Assyrians and the Babylonians, right? There's not people groups that he doesn't see. He's saying that there's a way that I know Israel that is different than the way I know the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and on I could go. Okay? In Hosea 13:5, "I knew you in the wilderness, in the land of drought." Now, he knew him in slavery. He knew him in the promised land. He's known him everywhere. But he's saying here, in the wilderness, in the time of drought, I knew you in a special way. In Matthew 7:23. In fact, let me do Psalm 1:6. "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." All right, so that there's a way that he knows the righteous that is different than the way he knows the wicked, and we see that. I could, compare these texts. The next one being Matthew 7:23, where he says, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness." So I know you well enough that you practice lawlessness, but I don't know you in a way that I would say I know you. Are you with me on this? That there's a way of knowing that is different than knowing. And I know that those are the same words. I think this one can help us really land the plane. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." There's knowing, and then there's knowing. Right? Are you not, do I need to show a graph? I'm willing. I mean, what are they going to do? Fire me? I don't work here, all right? They'll fire Dan. And so there's knowing, and then there's knowing. And what we have happening in this text is God says, "I foreknew you. I knew you beforehand." And what we see from these other texts is there's a special affection, a special love, a special delight in his covenant community that has been there since the beginning. And by the beginning, I mean always in the heart of God. Those whom he foreknew, foreloved, foredelighted in, set his affection on. For those whom he foreknew, he predestined. Now this is easier. He determined beforehand.